So, minds are funny things, and those of you who know me know, in particular, mine can be funny and not necessarily in a haha sort of way. When Jan, Stephen, Maureen, and I decided on the topic of this retreat, staying afloat in the floods of life, the first thing that came into my head was to think of the many cartoons, mostly in the New Yorker, as far as I know, in which one or two hapless folks are standing at the edge of a pier in a tub filled with concrete, waiting to be, in the faux mafia parlance of these cartoons, rubbed out. And behind those unfortunate folks are two mobsters. And you could tell they were mobsters because uh, they had sunglasses on, pinstripe suits, and carried machine guns. And in the caption, one of the mobsters would say something like, don't think of this as a rub out. I'm merely unfriending you. Or in one of my favorites, a middle aged suburban looking couple were wearing the concrete shoes. The man was in Bermuda shorts, and the woman had a big sun hat on. And as I said, they were wearing the concrete shoes. And one of the mobsters said, you folks thought you had selected the option to swim with the dolphins, but you mistakenly must have clicked on sleep with the fishes. And the point, to quote Ellen DeGeneres, the point I'm trying to make, and I do have one, is that it can be hard to keep our heads above the water in the face of the many difficulties we can have in our minds, in our hearts, and in society. We can so easily feel pulled under as if we were wearing those cement shoes. And today I'd like to talk about one of the specific types of cement shoes, in a Buddhist kind of way, that is guaranteed to pull us under. And those cement shoes are the delusion of self. In particular, I'll be talking about the Buddhist teachings and practice, most importantly, the practice of non-self, which Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing and is sometimes called emptiness. Now, quick caveat, as I'll explain, non-self is not a theoretical or academic topic, although it can seem like that at first. As with all the Buddhist teachings, the practice of non-self is entirely practical. Second, you absolutely don't need to be a Buddhist to appreciate and learn and benefit from the practice of non-self. As the Buddha taught, don't take my word or the Buddha's word for this. Try it on for size, and see what your own experience with non-self is. To set the stage, I think it's important to remember that the Buddha often said he really only taught two things: understanding how suffering arises and practicing how suffering can cease. We can't, unfortunately, go right to the end of suffering without first understanding how suffering arises. And the primary reason the Buddha taught that we suffer is clinging to a false or at least incomplete sense of self. This clinging is also sometimes known as ego, although not ego in the sense that we often use the word in the West, and certainly not ego in the clinical sense that psychotherapists use it. But it's also known as ego in our practice and selfing. Specifically, the Buddha taught that suffering arises when we cling to the delusion of thinking of ourselves as wholly separate, freestanding individuals, separate from everything and everybody else. And on the one hand, and we'll be getting into some subtle and nuanced stuff here. On the one hand, this delusion about self is conditioned into all of us. We're born with this. And on the other hand, this delusion is a delusion. It's simply not true, as I'll discuss. Yet this delusion pulls us down beneath the surface, just like the concrete shoes in the cartoons. Now, at one very important level, these teachings about non-self or interbeing are very attractive. It is, in my opinion, quite spiritual, very spiritual, to understand that we are all radically interconnected to everything and everybody else on Earth and throughout the universe. That's pretty wonderful and big stuff. And that we're not freestanding, wholly separate beings. But what does this mean specifically? Thich Nhat Hanh's famous analogy is to hold up a blank sheet of paper and urge people to not just see the paper, but to also see the sun and the wind and the soil and the rain that nourished the tree that would become the paper, to see the people who cut down the tree, the people who work in the paper mill, the people who made the equipment for all of this stuff, and the people who grew the food to feed all those folks, and on and on and on. Without one link in that chain, there is no paper. So the sun and the rain and so on are as much a part of that paper as the pulp that created the physical piece of paper. And the same is true for all of us. If we look closely, we can see how we are interconnected to all things despite our delusion that we are separate and unconnected. Like I said, it's a lovely spiritual idea, isn't it? We're all connected. And, as we used to say when I worked in politics, it has the added benefit of being true. I'm speaking from my personal experience, but I think it's pretty universal that when we think of ourselves as not being an intrinsic part of this larger, unspeakably beautiful and interconnected web, when we persist in the delusion that we are separate from everything and everybody, we can be very lonely. And in that delusion of separateness, it becomes easy to start craving things to be a certain way, craving states of mind, and being greedy about getting those objects that we think will make us happy, things that we think we deserve, things that at some level we believe will make us less lonely and more connected. And craving in this way is another primary area that the Buddha taught causes suffering, because our reasons for the craving can never be fulfilled. The things we crave, that we cling to, can't make us happy. The craving can't make us happy. It's not so much what it is that we're craving, whether it's a state of mind or possessions. Those things are kind of neutral. They're just things, really. But it's that craving, that delusion that as a separate person, we deserve this in order to be happy. That's what causes suffering. When I look back at the things I craved in this way over the years, with great hindsight, it sometimes seems comical. I remember as a teenager absolutely craving a certain type of car, which I believed would make me very cool and very popular and would have other benefits to me now. It seems foolish to me now, but when all I really wanted was to be connected to others and not feel so separate, not feel so alone. All of this suffering because I didn't understand the beauty and the power in the truth of non-self. As I mentioned, it's easy to think of non-self as an abstract or academic topic, but it really does play out, as was the case with my craving a car, in our everyday lives. When we think we're the center of the universe, we make everything about us, and woe to those who get in the way of this delusion. In other words, in the midst of our delusion about being a separate, fully separate self, we take everything personally. We believe everything is about us, and we fail to understand the truly universal and impersonal nature of all things, including our suffering. And we simply don't comprehend how we are so beautifully interconnected to all things and all people. The 5 remembrances are an excellent reminder of the impersonal nature of ourselves and the impersonal nature of how the world really works. You may have heard the 3 of us, Stephen and Jan and I, talking about the 5 remembrances previously. It's such an important teaching. The remembrances are, in brief, I am of a nature to grow old, get sick, die, and lose all that I hold dear. I cannot avoid this loss. And perhaps most important, in the face of this impermanence and loss, the 5th remembrance is, my actions are the ground on which I stand. They are my only true possession. In the sutta from which the 5 remembrances come, the Upajjhatana Sutta, also known as Subjects for Contemplation, the Buddha mentions that in the absence of mindful awareness, we typically have an unskilled intoxication. That was the word he used, intoxication, about our good health and good fortune while we have it. This intoxication leads to us being surprised and to suffering when we get sick, old, die, or lose what we hold dear. So, for example, in talking about how we react against the universal truth of illness, the Buddha said, and I'm quoting here, there are beings who are intoxicated with a typical healthy person's intoxication with health. Because of that intoxication with health, they conduct themselves in a bad way in body, in speech, and in mind. In other words, if we are intoxicated with the craving only for good health, or not dying, or not getting old, or not losing what we hold dear, we get drunk with the expectation that we will always be healthy or that we deserve to be healthy. And we suffer when this universal occurrence, in this case illness, actually occurs, which it inevitably will. So the thing we wish for isn't often the issue. As I mentioned, we all prefer to be healthy, and that's perfectly wonderful and good. It's the clinging to the outcome that causes us to suffer. It's the delusion we heap on top of the craving, such as health or ill health. And the delusion is that when we get unhealthy, it's only about us. When we do that, we make this ill health or old age, loss or death all about us, forgetting that impermanence and constant change, which inevitably leads to old age, sickness, death, and loss, has little to do with us. It's just the way of things. It's life living through us. It's universal, just like we were talking before about the breath being universal. And we suffer greatly when we take it personally. But getting old, sick, dying, that's the deal we all have been given for the incredible opportunity to be, for a while anyway, in this human body. This is how life is. It's not about us. It moves through us, but it's not about us. It's about the beautiful, enormous web of life, a web that includes all things, including old age, sickness, death, and loss. Just last week, I had yet another opportunity to learn this lesson. I wasn't feeling well at all, and home COVID test came up positive. And even before I got the results, my mind flew off in a million directions, all about me, of course, all about me, such as I'm dying. I just know it. This is it. I'll never feel better. And of course, one of my favorites, the classic, why me? Happily, I recalled the 5 remembrances, and as has always been the case, including when I have received some real dire medical challenges, as always was the case, it brought great relief and great joy to know that instead of being isolated and, separate and suffering, instead of being a victim, I was part of something greater, something amazing, because we all get sick. And of course, I took another test. In fact, I've taken 3 more tests since then, and they were all negative, and I feel perfectly fine. So there was all this suffering, really, literally, for nothing, other than a false positive that triggered all this suffering. You may have noticed, of course, a number of paradoxes in all of this. When I say that a sense of ourself as a freestanding entity is a delusion that causes suffering, that's being said by me, Dave, who is a separate self from you. And that's true too. And the wonderful thing about our practice is that we are training our mind to not see things only as this or that, but rather this and that. In other words, we're training ourselves to live and thrive with paradox. It reminds me of the old, not that funny Buddhist joke of the Zen student who goes to their teacher and asks, "If I have no self, whose back is hurting?" So we can take the whole thing of non-self in the wrong way, and that's not good either. So before proceeding further, I want to clear up a common misconception about non-self. We are indeed an intrinsic part of a larger whole, whether we know it or not. There were myriad causes and conditions over which we had absolutely no control, the vast majority of which occurred before we were even born, that led to our existence. And we wouldn't exist if we were wholly separate, because nothing arises out of nothing. So just like the piece of paper that Thich Nhat Hanh holds up, we're made of countless other things, causes, and conditions. And we all have bodies, we have minds, we have emotions. Our practice is the art. And the key word in this sentence is art. Our practice is the art of living in both worlds without overemphasizing either world, either this temporal self or the fact that we are all so wonderfully interconnected. It's the art of developing a truer perspective of what it means to have these bodies in mind. Non-self is not about obliterating the self. That is dangerous. I know people who have tried, and it doesn't come out well, believe me. I'm remembering a monk who once told me on a retreat that there must be a well-established self before non-self can arise. We exist in these universal factors, this radical interconnection of which we are part, which isn't personal. Factors such as old age, sickness, death, and loss work through us. They are universal. As I mentioned, they come with being human. Yes, they work on our physical selves, but they are not us. And this is where we really start getting into some finely shaded, nuanced territory. Think about the classic Buddhist analogy explaining non-self. Waves in the ocean. Waves arise from the sea only when causes and conditions are appropriate for that to happen. Wind, currents, temperature, I don't know what all, but certainly those things and probably more. And it's like us. We only arise as individuals when uncountable causes and conditions throughout history allow us to arise through a vast web of circumstances and countless other causes and conditions that are far more numerous than we can even begin to understand. Our parents met and had children only because of an equal number of causes and conditions that preceded them. And the same was true for all of our forebears, dating back to the beginning of humans. So waves arise and they appear to be individual, and to an extent they are. You can see individual waves. But just like us, waves are both individual and part of a larger whole. Literally, in the case of waves, the sea. In the case of us humans, the sea of countless, uncountable causes and conditions. And we all, every one of us, arise out of this vast universal sea of causes and conditions. And in that way, we are intimately related, connected, along with everything else on the earth, because everything else is also part of this remarkable web. Thich Nhat Hanh, when he uses this analogy, kind of with that sly sense of humor he can have, will say that one wave does not compare itself to others. This subject actually came up this morning. That wave is higher than me. What's wrong with me? Yet that's what we do when we believe we are separate and freestanding and not part of this great sea of life. So you can see that non-self isn't being either separate or being radically interconnected. It's a matter of both. And in our world, in our society, where the emphasis is always on it's got to be this or that, again, we're training our minds to realize that it can be this and that. And in fact, in life, it usually is. To narrow the focus just a bit, real quickly, this all leads to a specific type of suffering that's often called over-identification, which starts with thinking we are separate. We all do this. We all think, I'm totally amazing because I own this or have that. That's who I am. I'm all about being a Buddhist. Again, it doesn't matter what we cling to and over-identify with. Or I'm all about being a Democrat or a Republican, or I'm rich or I'm poor or I'm unworthy because I'm none of those things. And that's who we identify ourselves as. We cling to this identity as if it were a complete description of who we are, even though who we are is tied to everything else, all the causes and conditions that led to us being here. When we over-identify in this way, we put ourselves in a box, and we suffer when we're in this box because it's hard to be both in a box and connected to the world around us. I'll never forget in this retreat, I guess maybe 10 years ago, Sherry Maples described how hard it was when she was younger for her to come out as a lesbian, how it ran so counter to her conditioning and to societal expectations. But she related she eventually came out to herself and to the world, and I think most of her knew that part of her, of course. But and that was very important to her. It was about knowing and loving who she was. And there's nothing about non-self that would take us away from that need. As I said, we need a strong sense of self before we can have a strong sense of non-self. But then she added, and this initially I think perturbed some people, she said, I realized that I could be a lesbian or I could be free. And she was not in any way, shape, or form renouncing herself as a lesbian. She was just saying that if that's all that she thought she was not going to be open to so much of the other amazing parts of a radically interconnected life. This is where the rubber meets the road. It's where our practice becomes a practical act of liberation that isn't at all academic. We need to be who we are. We need to love ourselves as we are. And we also have to understand that there's so much more, and this isn't theoretical. So how do we do this? How do we practice non-self? Well, we begin what we've already been doing in this retreat. We meditate. That's the beginning. We step back as best we can from the fast, busy traffic in our minds. And sometimes it's moves right along real quickly. Sometimes it's just bumper to bumper and stop and go. But usually our mind is full of all these thoughts. So we step back and notice that that traffic very often, if not almost always, consists of thoughts that grow out of our delusion of self and the craving that arises out of this false sense of self. Craving things like pleasure, possessions, accomplishments, craving control, craving specific states of mind. And so we step back, watch all this traffic, and not connect to it, not attach to that traffic. We just notice that it's there, and we can even notice our tendency to grab hold of it and cling to that. And instead, when we observe these selfing thoughts arise, we return to our body and our breath in the present moment. The present moment is the only moment in which these thoughts of self can't control us. And when we're solidly in our body, in our breath in this way, in the present moment, we can more easily tell when our mind is selfing. And we learn to recognize, over time, we learn to recognize that selfing is often so deeply ingrained, so habitual, that we don't even think of it at all, let alone think of it as something out of the ordinary. So we practice observing, and we practice observing from the platform of our body, because meditation, mindfulness is, after all, a practice of embodiment, no different than Qigong or yoga, other than in its form. The more we practice this meditative awareness, the more we realize that we apply this selfing to even the simplest things, such as the breath. This is my in-breath. This is my out-breath. And we can start to see that just like old age, sickness, death, and loss, the breath is universal. As Jan said earlier, our body knows how to breathe. We don't have to learn. We don't excel at breathing. We just breathe. And the breath goes through us. But we can see as we practice, or we can start to see as we practice, that we personalize even something as simple as the breath. And when we practice in this way, as Joseph Goldstein notes, we change our orientation from I am to is. We loosen our grip on thoughts like I am happy, I am sad, I am angry, I am excited, I am breathing. And at the body level, we change that orientation as we practice over time. We change that orientation to is. Happiness is present. Anger is present. Breath has arisen and is present. And with this awareness, what arises is impersonal, and we can be fully present to it. And being fully present is a very powerful and important part of our practice. Thich Nhat Hanh says our full presence is the greatest gift we can give ourselves and others. And when we're wrapped up in ourselves, we're not fully present. As we change our orientation from I am suffering to there is suffering, we also change our orientation so that we see how we suffer and equally how others suffer. And this leads me to the fifth remembrance, which I mentioned but didn't talk about before. As we see how we suffer and how that suffering is universal because we all suffer, we can remember the fifth remembrance, which is my actions are my only true possession. They are the ground on which I stand. And the distance between our suffering and the suffering in the world, all the injustice of the world in general, and all the suffering in individuals that this injustice causes, the distance between our suffering and that suffering begins to diminish. This is how we engage our practice with true compassion, because we start to realize how interconnected each of our sufferings is, and including the suffering of those who cause us to suffer. And as such, our actions to alleviate suffering become less wrapped in ourselves and how we feel about ourselves and how we cling to outcomes, and become more compassionate, present, and skillful. There is nothing in the teaching of and practice of non-self that leads to indifference or inaction. In fact, quite the opposite. As Thich Nhat Hanh says, compassion is a verb. If anybody's suffering, we all suffer, and we want to alleviate suffering. So the teaching of non-self gives us tools to understand the true nature of suffering. And it helps us suffer less and not to create more suffering as we act in the world, to not take other people's actions so personally, and to not make people we disagree with other, which also increases their isolation and suffering. And it gives us the foundation to act wisely, to not roll over in the face of injustice, but to act with compassion. This practice of non-self can be hard. There's a lot of, I feel like I just stuck a toe in the water today. There's a lot of nuance here, and it's a lifetime practice, but it is also attainable. We can all do this. As Thich Nhat Hanh says, this aspiration to alleviate suffering, to let go of ourself, and this practice really is the practice of getting out of our own way. This practice is not a matter of faith. It's a matter of practice. And so let's practice. I'd like to, there's some time left in my little slot here, and I'd like to devote that to just a very brief, simple guided meditation that can perhaps, everybody will be in a different place, but perhaps open the door a little bit to a little bit more recognition about how we actually can practice non-self. So, as always, when we practice meditation, get comfortable, sit upright, aware and alert and relaxed all at the same time. Sense into the body, either a specific part of the body or the body as a whole. What's it like to inhabit your body in this moment? If you're able, and one problem with visualization practices is sometimes you don't feel like visualizing that, and that's okay. If this doesn't work for you, just follow your breath. But as you're able, as you settle into the breath, settle into your body, try to visualize your mind as luminous, having a soft, beautiful light from within. That's how the Buddha described the natural, unfettered state of mind. And, if possible, can you envision your mind as the spacious space, as if you're sitting on a beautiful lawn in an early spring day with a blue sky, and every now and then a bird will fly by. Think of our thoughts as that bird just flying by an open sky. You can observe it fly by, but you don't have to, and actually can't much, grab hold of it. It's just flying through, just like our thoughts fly through. We don't own them, they just arise. And again, if this part of the practice isn't working for you, that's fine. Just be in your body and return to your body whenever the mind pulls you away. But if you're able to be in your spacious, luminous mind or to envision it, that's wonderful too. And now, with the tip of the hat to Thich Nhat Hanh, who I don't believe actually came up with this meditation himself, but it was the first time I heard it was from him. Let's turn your attention directly to the act of breathing. Experience the felt sensations of breathing, the chest rising when you breathe in, for example, the chest falling as you breathe out, or your belly or the small of your back rising and falling. Next, we're going to repeat 4 very simple phrases as you breathe. Breathing in, I'm aware that I am breathing in. Breathing out, I am aware that I am breathing out. Breathing in, I'm aware I'm breathing in. Breathing out, I am aware that I am breathing out. Now let's depersonalize the breath a little bit and repeat inwardly. Breathing in. Breathing out. Breathing in. Breathing out. Perhaps you can sense how much or whether there is an implied I or me in that second phrase. Are you owning the breath? Even a little bit? That's okay, that's natural. We're doing this practice to just start to recognize how much of ourselves we attach to everything. Breathing in, breathing out. Next, as you breathe in, inwardly say, breathing. And as you breathe out, inwardly say, breathing. And again, just see if you can tell how much personalizing there is, even with this pared down thing that we just said, breathing. And finally, and you don't have to attach this to either the in-breath or the out-breath, breath. breath. If you do discern some personalizing of the breath, just notice it. If you can let it go, let it go. It's the noticing, it's the observing that's the important part here. Breath has arisen. Breath. So let's meditate in this way, for another 4 or 5 minutes until I ring the bell.